I think you guys are going to really like this work today. It's kind of relatable and it's also sort of terrifying at the same time. So this is an interesting question. So how do artists use commentary to recruit? So maybe they're recruiting for a specific idea, or maybe they're recruiting for an ideal in general. So how do they use their own visual commentary to get you on their side? It's kind of a complex question. I see Elizabeth just typing. I also see Erin is typing. So you had an idea, now you don't. You consider your own reaction. What does, say, a news photographer have to do to get people's interest or get them motivated? Yeah, so you can use your different techniques to sort of control the idea. But you can also think about, say you have like your social media open and you're scrolling through the feed. What will your finger stop on in terms of images? It's not going to be a run-of-the-mill image, right? They have to do something to kind of pull you in. Something that is bright and colorful, right? And so another word for it is sensationalize. And the root of that there is the senses, right? So the artist will play up the senses in some way. They'll play up the color, they'll play up the drama. It's not going to be a subtle image at all. And that's the same thing for a lot of our works in art history, is that it's kind of sensationalized to pull people into something. And this takes us directly to this work. So Elizabeth, why don't you take the bar, here, let me give you your tools. Why don't you take the bar to the left, which is pointing at this knife he's holding, and Erin, why don't you take the bar to the right. Remember, there's no right or wrong answer here. You're just trying to look at the image and from what you're seeing, figure out what's happening. The benefit of starting it out this way is that you guys might see something that I don't, already knowing the background of the story. Blade emerging from shadows and light. Looks like he's trying to get away from the other guy so we won't hurt him. Right. Yeah. This image is actually quite graphic. Truly it is. We see this, and I'll go to the next slide and maybe we can see a bigger image. Yeah. So we see this dark background here, and then a boy. We can tell he's a boy based on the age and shape. And he's mostly in shadow. Even his arm is in shadow right here to the right. and you see a barely distinguishable hand holding on to a knife or a sword. In this image, of course, is not very high resolution, so you're going to see a lot better quality images later on. If you look this up later on, and then you see this right here. This is actually a head that has been disembodied. Yes. And if you look at the original image, the sort of streaks coming down from beneath the head look very graphic, right? Like what you would think. Sensational, but exactly. So what makes you wonder now that you have seen all of these things? What are you wondering? The first thing that comes to your brain. Why did he behead the guy? And why does he look so regretful about it? Right. Ooh, those emotions that we have right here. So you're already seeing a pretty complex situation happening right here. This is, in fact, a story from the Bible. Can you guess the story? It's from, I believe, the Old Testament. David and Goliath. Right. So you can tell by the proportions here, just by the shape of the head alone, if you put your fingers on your screen to measure that head and hold it up next to the boy's head, the man who held this head must have been huge, right? Because our heads are in proportion to our bodies. The smaller people have smaller heads normally. And so we see David and Goliath in this horrific scene. And that really goes into a whole piece about the artist. Of course, this is about the artist in the end. The name of our artist today is Caravaggio. Let me change the color of this. So Caravaggio, get a big circle right here, was such a passionate person. To his own detriment, he was a passionate person. So Caravaggio was in the Baroque era, so right here, so you can see it. Baroque is a huge era of art, also an era of music that came basically right after the Renaissance. So right after the Renaissance, the Catholic Church was going through a whole upheaval of trouble, and that was because of how the church was being run. Have you guys hit this at all in your history classes? Just out of curiosity. She might know more about it than me at this point. If you have hit it in your history class a year or two ago, they would have used the words Reformation and Counter-Reformation. Okay, that sounds familiar. So, the Reformation is also called the Counter-Reformation, and I would say if you were to talk to I grew up Catholic, and if you were to talk to a Catholic person about this stuff today, it's widely understood to be sort of old history. Definitely does not reflect what the current church follows. So it's more of a historical discussion now than it is a spiritual one. But Caravaggio was in fact Catholic in an era in which people were leaving the Catholic Church by a huge amount. You can tell from his name that he is in fact Italian, in which today, of course, Italy still has a national religion of Catholicism, not just Christianity, but specifically Catholicism. So people were leaving because things were really not very good in the Catholic Church. What are some things you can remember why people would have left? It really comes down to how the heads of the church were running it. They kind of were breaking a lot of rules of the spirit. Greed, right. You could buy something called an indulgence from a priest, which was essentially if you had enough money, you can essentially sin and pay or bribe your way into heaven. That's how they saw it. So It was not a fair representation to everyone. It was once again another thing to really make the elite and the people with power do whatever they want, which was totally against the emerging Christian religions that were what we now know as Protestants. And I think I spelled that right. I might not have. But the root of why it's called Protestant, okay, thanks. The root of why it's called Protestant is in that word to protest. Yes, exactly. So they were against all these terrible things that were happening within the church. So naturally, do you think the church was happy to have all these people leave? No, right. Because when you're a member of a church, you have to pay something called a religious tithe or a tax. And so as if people are leaving, so are their religious taxes. And communities will pay a tithe. There goes the wealth, exactly. Remember, at this point, artists were employed to paint in gold, beautiful things for each churches. Churches had a lot of collective money. The larger they were, the more money they had. So there was a financial reason for why they wanted them to stay. So the Pope, of all people, and the Pope right now, this was a pretty shady Pope. I believe his name was Pope Innocent in this era. There was like many Innocents. It might have been Pope Innocent the 9th or the 10th. Basically, whenever you choose a new rank in the Catholic Church, if you reach a new level of power, you take a new name, which is why there are so many popes with the same name. You normally want to be named after someone that precedes you, so it's rare to find someone who takes a whole new name. Anyway, so the Pope actually commissioned Caravaggio to paint these really dramatic scenes in the churches to bring people in. Caravaggio works on life-size scale. He was very dramatic. He was also a very impassioned man, and there was a reason why he had to actually hide out in a lot of churches. And that's because he killed a guy over a tennis match. Yes. So it was not an honorable death or a killing at all. They were playing tennis. Caravaggio lost, and then rather than be an okay loser, he challenged the other man to a duel. And then he killed him. And do you think these kinds of duels were legal? No. It's actually pretty rare to find a time in which they were fully legal. There are always, huge repercussions for them. Sorry, working through a cold. But he dueled the other man, he killed him, and then since it was not a sanctioned duel, what do you think would happen next? Yes, they tried to arrest him. And at this point, and it still is true in many countries, and I think maybe even in the U.S., I'm not sure, you could actually hide out in a church for a time before you were arrested. Yes, exactly. Sanctuary. Thank you so much. He appealed for sanctuary. There's actually a church in Sweden right now who they had a continuing service happening for over a year to help a family that was going to be deported. So people volunteered and would take different shifts in the church so that it was always had a running service so that it was an incredibly long sanctuary, essentially. And so finally, I think the government made a deal to have a temporary hold on it all. But so yeah, it still exists today. But sanctuary is normally like a finite amount of time. You have a day to a week on how much you can hide in the church. And so the Pope, using his connections with the law, said, you know what, Caravaggio, we'll protect you from the law, in which you'll probably be arrested and possibly be hanged for what you've done if you paint for us. So he was essentially going from one church to the next, painting these huge paintings And the models were normally common people. Caravaggio was really dicey for the era. He was known to actually bring in prostitutes and paint them as like the Virgin Mary. So he was a pretty risque kind of guy, not surprisingly. Yeah, and that, just imagine the level of discomfort that people felt when they would be sitting in their pews, or maybe even like just standing on the ground, because some places didn't have pews if you weren't wealthy, and then looking up at these paintings during the service and pointing and going, I know that girl, I know that boy. he's the servant of this guy. So Caravaggio didn't actually like the wealthy a lot, but the wealthy benefited him a lot. Lots of stuff going on here. No, not at all. But so Caravaggio was using his art to hide out, but also make his religion relevant again to people, and by bringing in normal people and not just the wealthy. If you look at this piece here, can you guess which figure is a self-portrait of Caravaggio? The head, right. So we know that he was a very guilty fellow as well. We can tell that he had a lot of self-loathing, because that is actually him, Caravaggio, painted as the head. He beheaded himself, totally. You can really start to understand the guy a little bit more now. He had a lot of guilt in his life that he had to deal with. So I found right here, this is actually a self-portrait that he made of himself around the same time. I'll go back and forth so that you can just see how close it is. Yeah, so it could be something that's called foreshortening. I'm writing it here so you can see. Foreshortening is actually a great thing to bring up because it is a very difficult thing to draw. Especially if you have your foot out towards someone or your hand out towards someone, and your hand is super big, getting closer to them, but getting really dramatically smaller back to you. So you're right, it could be a little bit of foreshortening as well. That's a great observation. You can see a little bit of it happening in David's hand right here. So if it went back in proportion, yeah, it does. You guys have seen Lord of the Rings, I take it, right? Am I presuming too much? No, you haven't. Oh, Aaron, you would like it, at least in terms of camera work. If you look up Lord of the Rings extras, they actually have a lot of little features with how they used foreshortening and camera angles to make some things happen. I think you'd think it was interesting. So even if you don't want to watch the movie, you can look at the cinema and how they controlled that. I actually found a version of The Hobbit in which they combined all three movies and took out everything that wasn't actually in The Hobbit, which was a lot. And it went down to 1 3-hour movie. And it was pretty good, too. Yeah. Yeah. Well, at least those videos, I think those clips are all online. And you could definitely look them up so you don't have to sit and watch the whole thing, but you could still marvel at the spectacle of it. Okay, so I have found a little bit more about this guy, Caravaggio, in this piece in terms of symbolism. Let me make this box a little bit bigger. There we go. So if you guys could click that link, I think it's only about 3 minutes. After you're done watching it, come back and tell me something that surprised you. You don't have to watch the whole thing either. As soon as you know something that surprised you, you can write it on the board. Ooh, yes. Mm, that's a good one. Something to know too is that if you look at the Renaissance and Baroque era of art history, there are literally hundreds of versions of David and Goliath. Yeah, that's what got me to the David as the younger version of himself. His younger version of himself is killing his older version of himself. I think of that like today in the news with so many things that are happening to people now that came from yearbooks or newspapers from when they were younger, like the consequences that we're seeing happening in our own political system and culture. Cool. Aaron, did anything in there surprise you in terms of symbolism? Oh, cool. Nice. So moving forward, the honors question for today is about social reaction. So why do you think an artist would include their own pain in their work? Let me get out my snipping tool real quick, and I'm going to take a screenshot of this to upload. I'm going to go into the folder and see if it real quick. Yeah, so it's in some way therapeutic for the artist. That's an honorable thing. Michelangelo really hated himself a lot too. I would say if Michelangelo and Caravaggio were alive at the same time, they'd be very similar, but they couldn't stand to be around each other. That kind of similarity. Um, Michelangelo from the Renaissance was known to paint himself like going through pain or peeled skin or something like that. He was a very similarly graphic guy. Yeah, so you think maybe there's not a culturally relevant way in which they can exert their feelings in their own life, so they've chosen to do it in their art. I had a really good class in college. It was called a topics course in art history, and it was all about martyrdom of the artist. So that would be spelled like this, martyrdom, or the martyr. And it all went back to this ancient story, an ancient myth in which it was Marsyas was the name. He looks like Pan. He was half donkey, half man, and he was a famous lute player, or no, maybe he played the pipes. Anyway, he was a famous musician of like mythical world, and he never said he was great, but everyone else said, "Oh, Marsyas is so amazing. He's better than Apollo." So of course, Apollo appeared and challenged Marsyas to basically like a battle of the bands. So he said, if you win, Marsyas, you can keep that title, and I might even make you a god. If you lose, I'll skin you alive. And of course, yes, he lost. So Apollo skinned Marsyas alive, even though Marsyas never made no claim to being the best. It was other people. So since then, it's been a common sort of myth, but also in a way in a reality, that as artists, we have to suffer or sacrifice for our art. And even Michelangelo would say that his palette knife, that knife he used to mix up paints, was every time he mixed up a paint color, it was like skinning his own body. So he was always sacrificing for it. When, in reality, I don't think art has to be like that at all. but it is interesting how that's like a common thing still, is how much pain sometimes has to be involved into creating certain works. Which actually goes really well into this next piece. So rather than show a contemporary artist today, I'm going to show you guys a student of Caravaggio. So you can be a student of an artist today. You can be a student of Caravaggio as well. All you have to do is look up their artworks and try to recreate them. And that's how you learn, right? So Artemisia Gentileschi, still in the Baroque era, but she started copying Caravaggio's works after he was dead. So big era, but a couple of lifetimes in between. And this is her famous painting right here of Judith slaying Holofernes, another biblical tale. And so you can see Judith is in the yellow gown over here, and I believe the woman in the blue gown is her maid, and then Holofernes, can't remember, is her husband or her prosecutor. This is another story from the Bible that has a very dark side, but a story of a woman seeking vengeance. And Artemisia Gentileschi, she is probably one of the huge female superstars of this time. She was actually making work alongside men, selling work alongside men. People really wanted to buy it. She definitely studied Caravaggio. You can see so many commonalities between their styles. But she had a different backstory. If you actually go to her Wikipedia page, you can read it in detail. I worry that with it being a live recording, I might actually be like poo-pooed at telling you guys so many details. But Artemisia Gentileschi was assaulted in her study, and she never got her vengeance in real life. So she was assaulted by a man and never was able to have any legal repercussions to in any way like help her out during that process. So she kind of devoted a lot of her work into these stories of women protagonists getting their power back, and often through violence. So kind of similar to Caravaggio's piece where you're seeing the pain coming out in his own work, you're seeing here not only her pain, but also her seeking vengeance, right? And she never did get that, especially in her lifetime, but these works were highly collected while she was living. So she was considered pretty famous for her time. She even traveled to work in England for a while. But of course, most of her work she's known for is her heyday was in Italy. So I think this is also a very good artist to bring up because, you know, the major timeline of art history is of course represented mostly by men because that's how the culture and society was set up. But there were many women still working. And at this point in history, the people buying the artwork and setting it up in the houses were women. So imagine if you had a certain level of means, a husband would, and his wife, they had different duties. The husband worked to manage the estate and the finances, but it was the wife's duty to decorate and fill the house, make it look pleasant, and also it had to be contemporary with the times. And that happened for hundreds of years. That was the culture. And so, in a way, it was the woman's job to actually research and find the artwork that should be represented in their house. And this was a big favorite. A lot of people really actually loved her pieces. And not surprisingly, a lot of women were actually buying it in the end, with some money from their husband's estate, but women were buying it. Okay, so over here, I put the image to the right this time so that we can see it without forgetting it. Can one of you take style and the other take process? Let's see, Elizabeth, you took the left side the last time, so why don't you take the process this time? And Aaron, you take the style. Just use some keywords to describe. Cool. We're just using keywords to describe this piece before we move on from it. Right. So the style is brutal, showing its own pain, an oil painting. And I also like to think, if you look at this piece here, it was really simple, right? When you have a really dark background, it's a lot easier to occupy a space. And it's simple and it's dramatic, but can you guys think, if this was a movie poster, what genre of movie would it look like? Mystery horror, right. So it even translates to our own conception today of what a scary poster or an image should look like. So it's still sort of thriving. Okay, so compare and contrast. It's like the contrast will be pretty easy. Comparison will have to be, I think, pretty literal. And you guys are, this is a free write wherever, whatever comes to mind. Remember, you can be real basic. Like, they both involve people. I'll take that one. And they're both stories from old times. Stories are people from old times. Hmm. I acknowledge. And then I might use, what's the word I'm thinking of? Allegory. So, hide. Period. Humanism. Cool. All right. Are we good to move on to the last thing? I think it's the last thing. It feels like the last thing. Oh, last two things. So how does David with the Head of Goliath, how do you think it affects the art world? And we even had a pretty, actually, we already had a pretty literal one. He directly inspired Artemisia Gentileschi, so, who came later. So maybe even looking at her work, how does that affect us today? Yeah, that's a great way to summarize it. So transferring emotions to the work to share an idea or ideal. I like that. Okay, and we'll conclude with, how does this impact you? Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I feel like people really look for that too when they're looking at an artist's work. They're often trying to interpret like what was the artist going through, even if it's something super pragmatic, right? Even like in weird places like in emails or in text messages, like how much are we trying to decipher what someone really means based on the words they've given, right? We're always looking for subtext. And I think it's really interesting for us as humans that we're constantly interested in other people and what they're going through, in that we feed off of it. Yeah, we love to read between the lines here, for sure. All right, guys. Excellent job today. I'm going to turn off the recording.